to the June 3rd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Fred Mulkowski, and this week we're looking ahead to Churchill Downs' Saturday card. All stakes during the Pick 5 sequence, races 7 through 11. One graded stakes in there, that is the Arlington Stakes, which has been repurposed from the now shuttered Arlington Park. But we've got 4 other stakes in this sequence that are ungraded. The Shawnee kicking things off, the Aristides a little bit later, the Blame Stakes for the older horses going 2 turns on the main track, and we'll close things out with a pretty interesting turf race, the Audubon for 3-year-olds. That's the final race at Churchill Downs on Saturday, which closes out this Pick 5 sequence. Craig, when I handicapped this one, when I went through the first few races, it seemed like this was a sequence that we could get through pretty thinly. Things open up a little bit towards the end, especially in that last race.
Yeah, if I had to come up with one word for this Pick 5, I would probably say manageable. When I looked at the field sizes and, who the horses were, I think there are some legs that are easier than others. It definitely gets a little tougher at the end. So I thought it was an interesting sequence.
Yeah, definitely starts off looking pretty logical, and we'll begin things with race 7. That is the Shawnee Stakes, going 1 mile and a 16th on the main track for the fillies and mares. And no real surprise, Craig, when you look at the morning line for this race. We've got an odds-on favorite in Pauline's Pearl. She has recently won a Grade 1 race, and now she's dropping into this ungraded stakes. So definitely a easier spot for her than last time, though I wouldn't say that the La Troyenne was the toughest Grade 1 that we've seen run this year, or that we'll see run probably even last month. But Pauline's Pearl, definitely a deserving favorite in here. I think it's just a matter of how short a price you think is fair on her and how much you really want to lean on her to kick off this sequence.
Yeah, this is one I'm kind of glad it's the first leg, because, you could always move to the Pick 4 if you wanted, if you're not interested in taking a very short price. But we will get to see the odds. And just say, I don't think that La Troyenne was the strongest Grade 1 we're going to see, but it was still a stronger field than this. There is one other horse I'd be interested in using here, and that's the 4-horse Army Wife, who is coming off a layoff. We haven't seen her since Churchill, the fall meeting last year, when she was in the Grade 2 Fall City. She ran okay that day, but the one thing I noticed that Pauline's Pearl doesn't have is huge speed figure edge over this field. So if I was going to take a shot with another horse, it would be that 4-year-old making her first start, who, with any improvement, could run just as well, just as fast as Pauline's Pearl. Her trainer, Mike Maker, is good off the layoff, so I would definitely use her in my Pick 5 as well.
Yeah, I'm very much with you. I didn't really see this as a 1-horse race. I saw it more as a 2-horse race, because Army Wife, based on her 3-year-old credentials, is every bit as good as Pauline's Pearl. Now, she hasn't proven that she's taken that step forward as a 4-year-old, which Pauline's Pearl already has. Army Wife is getting kind of a late start to her 4-year-old campaign here at the beginning of June. But she ran some really nice races last year. I mean, knocking heads against Malathaat and Clairiere and the Alabama and the Cotillion, a couple of Grade 1s. She was 3rd in each of those races. The one time that she faced off against Pauline's Pearl in the Iowa Oaks, she beat her by over 5 lengths. So I think Army Wife definitely has the credentials to beat Pauline's Pearl. It's just a matter of whether or not she's ready off the layoff. I have to imagine she's going to be the clear-cut second choice in this race. I don't see how Ava's Grace is going to be the second choice as she's listed on the morning line. So I don't think we're going to get anywhere near 9-2 on Army Wife, but I do view her as a viable minor upset candidate. So I would want to use both of these horses. And depending on how short Pauline's Pearl is, which you will be able to see before you put in this Pick 5 ticket, I might actually want to upgrade Army Wife a little bit and lean on her. If she's somewhere in the 3-1 range, I think that would be value.
Yeah, I would agree. I think maybe this would be like if you figure all the other horses have maybe a 25% chance to win, maybe it's of the remaining part, Pauline's Pearl is probably 60%, Army Wife 40% of that remainder. So I think it is a lot closer than what the morning line shows. I don't, as you said, I'm sure Army Wife is going to be the second choice, but it'll probably be a pretty big gap back to her from the favorite.
Let's move on to the second leg of this Pick 5 sequence, race 8. It is the Grade 3 Arlington Stakes, going 1 mile and a 16th on the turf course. Churchill making the, I guess, upsetting to some decision to reuse these Arlington Stakes races at their track. But this one, Craig, it's just a a decent grade 3 event, only a field of 6 signed on. I wouldn't say that anybody in here is completely ridiculous. You can make a case for just about every horse in this field, so it's a competitive 6-horse field. There are 2 horses that like to do their best running towards the front end, those being the number 4 Get Smokin' and the number 6 Gray's Fable. I kind of agree with the pace projector, though. Get Smokin' just looks like he's faster than Gray's Fable, and I wonder if that's going to compromise the ladder runner a little bit.
Yeah, you would think, and maybe compromise both. It's hard for me to say. I guess it depends if we're going to get the same version of Get Smoking that we saw last year. He looked okay in his first start at Tampa Bay, but he did have a clear lead and got run down by Cheryl Spade, who did go on to win a Grade 1 next time out. Then went to Dubai for some unknown reason. Tried 6 furlongs, a distance the horse hadn't sprinted since his debut. Was no factor at all. So you kind of have that wild card of how this one's going to come back. So I think the pace projector is interesting. It may be a little closer than what is shown. It looks like Gray's Fable was, maybe they were toying with trying to rate him and get things done a little better, because he had shown not a lot of finish in a couple of his recent starts where he had led, but when they went back to front running tactics, he was able to get the job done. So I would assume they're going to try here. Another price that isn't necessarily a speed horse, but its best races come right up on the front end, is Field Pass, who's actually the morning line favorite in here. So I think it might be a little more contentious than what the pace projector shows.
Yeah, I could see that occurring, especially because Gray's Fable, when you look through his PPs, he is a horse that when he does not make the front end, the results just aren't there. I mean, he really needs to be on the lead and a clear lead at that to have his best chance to win. So we'll see if he's able to get there. Get Smokin' is a pretty fast horse, and I wouldn't imagine that Javier Castellano is going to be rating him, breaking inside of those 2 other speed horses that are drawn to his outside. So we'll see how that all plays out. I think from an ability standpoint, Get Smokin' probably the best horse in this race, but like you were saying, there's the question mark with him coming back from Dubai. He didn't run at all in that Alcalá sprint. Probably getting back to a more appropriate distance here, but you always wonder if these horses are going to come back as the same after an overseas trip like that. The horse that you mentioned, Craig, that I know you weren't necessarily interested in, but I don't really see as a major danger in this race, is the number 5 Field Pass. Just feels like he's gone off form recently. He just didn't run well in that Henry Clark last time at Laurel. When you watch that race, he kind of was drifting out coming off the far turn, like something was bothering him a little bit. The winner of that race, Chez Pierre, a horse we've talked about, might be pretty good, but still, I didn't like the way he got nipped for second at the end. It just feels like maybe he's a horse that got into really good form last year and hasn't carried on with it. I wanted to go in a different direction. I'm actually pretty interested down towards the inside in the number 2 Floriform. He is a horse that came off a long layoff in February to be 3rd behind Get Smokin' in the Tampa Bay Stakes, but I thought ran really well that day. Cheryl Spite, like we were saying, he's in great form, came back to win that Grade 1 Maker's Mark, and then they set their sights a little bit lower last time with Floriform in an allowance race at Keeneland. And even though he only won by half a length, I thought that he did it pretty easily. He was trying to lug in a little bit through the stretch, so Joel Rosario couldn't really fully set him down to a drive, but he ran by those horses like you would want to see a superior horse do so, with plenty of ease. So I think he's one that actually has some upside now in just the 8th start of his career as a 4-year-old. So I liked him the best, and I thought he would get a good trip stalking inside behind those 3 speed horses.
Yeah, we landed on the same horse as I guess we would say our top pick, because I saw the same things you did in Floriform. I liked it. He's a lightly raced 4-year-old. I think he's got a lot of ability, so he would be my top pick as well. It's just I have some question marks about the others. I also don't think he's going to be bet as low as the 4-1 odds would show when you look at some of the credentials of the others in here. I guess we'll see. I thought the morning line was a little tricky in this race. They have 5 of the horses of the 6 between 5-2 and 4-1. So to me, it doesn't seem like they can all get bet like that. Another one I'd be interested in somewhat is Admission Office. Not really at the 3-1 morning line, but I don't think that's going to happen with him. He hasn't had good form lately. but he does come in as a first-time gelding. He's been laid off for quite a while, but Brian Lynch is red hot, and he's a guy who can bring him back ready to run off the bench. So he's one I wouldn't want to totally dismiss either, especially if it gets a little contested up front. So as you said in the beginning, probably all of these horses have a chance. Even the one horse we haven't mentioned yet, like the King. It's not like he doesn't fit from a speed figure perspective. I'm just not sure he's quite at the level of these others in here, but he's also going to be double digits. So a pretty wide open race for me, but I agree with you on 4
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I have no idea how they're going to bet this race, so I don't want to be too critical of the morning line here. I was a little bit surprised to see admission office that low, but he is a horse with plenty of back class. I just kind of can't take him here coming off that long a layoff. I also think admission office is a horse that does his best running going a little bit farther than a mile and a 16th. Even though he's been successful doing this in the past, his better speed figures have come going longer distances. So it felt to me like this was probably just a prep for something longer. You mentioned that long shot, like the King. I don't think he's impossible by any means in this race. I mean, he also is a 4-year-old who's relatively lightly raced compared to some of these other ones. He showed promise in a few tough spots last year. I didn't think he ran that badly against a really tough allowance field at Keeneland coming off the layoff last time. So I could certainly be convinced to use him at a decent price. And this is a spot where I kind of figured Get Smokin' would be the favorite, probably a lukewarm one at that. And I'm not really against him. I just didn't want to take that sort of price on a horse that has some questions to answer. So I'd lean on Floriform. I would use Like the King as a backup and Get Smokin' as well. Let's move on to race 9, the Aristides Stakes, going 6 furlongs on the main track for the older horses. And Craig, this is one of a few races during the sequence where you look through and there's not a whole lot of pace signed on. And I think that's really going to have to take it into consideration when you're formulating your opinions in this race, because there are quite a few contenders who need some pace to have their best shot. And it just seems like they're not going to get it here.
Yeah, I would agree. No arguing with the pace projector here. I guess Top Gunner would be the early leader, but he's not exactly a horse who likes to go out and rip fast fractions on the front end. He has won wire to wire in the past, and I do think he'll be in the front, but it just kind of shows how little speed there is. That not only is he on the front end, he's shown well clear of the others. So just because of that alone, I think you have to consider Top Gunner a strong contender. And some of those you mentioned, a horse like Bob's Edge, who is a lukewarm morning line favorite in here, he's a horse who definitely needs some pace, and I would be hard pressed to see him getting up in here. I thought he was pretty dull last time in the Count Fleet at Oaklawn. Admittedly, he was chasing the very fast Jackie's Warrior, who was coming off a layoff that day, but he just seemed to really have trouble getting into the race, and I think that's something that could be a big problem in this field.
Yeah, we're pretty much on the same page about Bob's Edge. It feels like he could go favored here. And I know that some people were really taken with the late runs that he put in a couple of those races at Oaklawn earlier this year. But when you look back through those fields, just not the strongest competition overall. I think that he was a little bit flattered by the horses he was running against, got pace in those races, whereas that's probably not going to be the case here. And I agree with you. I thought that he should have gotten a piece of that Jackie's Warrior race last time. He just wasn't able to close down a couple of horses that probably he should have been able to reel in. So I was not that positive on Bob's Edge as the potential favorite in this race. I agree with you about Top Gunner. The TimeformUS Pace Projector has him on the lead in a situation favoring horses with that running style. And like you, I've got no argument with that. It just seems like if Rayla Gutierrez gets as aggressive as he's supposed to with this horse, he's going to be clearly in front of this field early. And that might be good enough because he's been in great form lately. Probably not facing as tough a field as he's meeting here, but if he runs a similar speed figure to at least what he ran 2 back at Oaklawn Park, I think he's going to be pretty tough. So I'm definitely not against Top Gunner. The other horse that I think is going to get the right kind of trip, who I do want to upgrade at a better price, is the number 7, Jalen Journey. This is a horse, when you look through his past performances, he runs his best races when he's able to be close to the pace. Now, the problem is he's not always able to get there because sometimes he doesn't break that sharply, or when he lands in a faster paced race, he's just not quick enough to get near the lead. But in this spot, breaking just outside of the controlling speed, I feel like he's going to be able to get that preferred stalking trip. And he's put forth some big efforts before in Steve Asmussen's barn when he's able to get that preferred stalking journey. So I think the Jalen journey is a pretty interesting alternative here.
Yeah, and I like him as well. He's kind of my co-top pick in here because I don't think Top Gunner has to win. And I actually like the horse to his outside as well, Long Range Toddy, who also comes out of that Jackie's Warrior race. And he looks like he has a dull running line that day, but he was actually pretty close up to Jackie's Warrior, and they were just going too quick for him. I liked his prior race at Keeneland in the Commonwealth where he ran second at huge odds behind Prevalence that day. And I just think in a race that's pretty open, for me, it's going to come down to the three outside horses. I think they're all going to be forwardly placed. They shouldn't have any problem getting a good position. And they all have similar speed figures. So the better prices come on the outside too. That's the two I would say were kind of my co-top picks. And then I would use Top Gunner a little more as a defensive horse to use, because I just don't love him in here despite that pace edge, because to me he's not a true front runner.
Yeah, I've got no idea what to do with Long Range Toddy. Maybe he'll be a solid price in this race, so you might want to upgrade him. That Commonwealth two-back, Craig, I know it got a decent speed figure, and it looked like a solid race at the time, but horses have not come back out of there to run particularly well. The only horse that really achieved a result out of that race was the long shot 3 Technique, who came back to upset another race on Derby Day. But Long Range Toddy, he's just... I don't know. I felt like the pace horses in that Commonwealth have not come back to run particularly well, so I didn't know what to do with him. Another horse that I kind of was struggling to know what to do with is the number 1 Bango, who has plenty of races at Churchill Downs from last year that put him right in the mix. Seemed like he maybe went a little bit off form last year, but are we supposed to just forgive his return last time? He was pretty dull in that early May race at Churchill Downs, but I mean, it was his first start in about six months. So, I mean, we could forgive it. And if he runs back to his races from last year, he's a contender in here and he's got some tactical speed. I just didn't know exactly what to do with him.
Yeah, I had a hard time with him as well. I mean, I guess you could be tempted when you look up his record. He's really good at Churchill. He's 5 for 8 on that surface, where he's only 3 for 14 everywhere else. But to me, that was a little more of just the races he was in more so than loving Churchill, because when you look at the speed figures, there's no real notable difference. And his return was at Churchill anyway, where he didn't run particularly well. So I think what I didn't really like was the inside post position. I think he's probably not going to be as close as he would like to be. But I mean, I couldn't blame somebody for using him. As you said, that six-month layoff. Maybe he was just dull and the trainer would do better second out. But he is usually a pretty good layoff trainer. If you look at the TimeformUS ratings, first off the layoff, he's an 89. Second off the layoff, 75. So he was probably, I would want to think, ready to go. So for me, I was a little more against him than the others.
Yeah, one more horse that I don't necessarily like in this race, and I'm guessing Craig doesn't either, that some people might gravitate towards, is the number 2 Miles Ahead, who's got plenty of speed figures to put him in the mix here. But this horse, I believe, was a private purchase after his race 2 back, transferred to a different trainer, now winds up in another barn again. And when you look back to this horse's past performances, he has only done his good running for trainer Eddie Pliza. The times that they've tried to switch up who's training him, it just has not worked out. I know he's tried some tougher spots when he shipped before, but it just feels like this horse is a real Gulfstream specialist that did well in his former barn. So I'm skeptical he's going to be able to recapture that form for new connections.
Yeah, I didn't give him much of a shot in here. The other horse we haven't even mentioned, and he's only 4-1 on the morning line, is Necker Island. So I don't want to totally dismiss him, but for me, he's a horse that he's been routing, going 1 turn mile at Churchill, 2 turn mile before that, and he has no speed in those races. So it's hard for me to think a cut back to 6 is what this horse is going to want, particularly in a race with no pace. And this is one I can't agree with the morning line. I don't see any way this horse is 4-1 in this field.
You know, I agree with you. And those who have been paying close attention in Kentucky will probably know that the Chris Hartman barn, whatever magic they had going on last fall and over the winter, seems to have dissipated over the past 2 months. Chris Hartman is 6 for 51 with 12% win rate with an 88-cent ROI, which is a far cry from the stats that he was posting prior to that. So it just feels like the barn's going through a bit of a slump right now. Let's move on to race 10, the Blame Stakes, 1.1 miles on the main track, and kind of a surprise entrant in this race, Craig, is American Revolution, the very talented New York bred who was supposed to make his seasonal debut back on Monday, Memorial Day at Belmont Park in a restricted New York bred race. It didn't fill. I think only 2 entered to run against him. So Todd Pletcher kind of had to reformulate the plan and found this race at Churchill to ship him to, going the 2 turns on the dirt. What's interesting here is when I look at the TimeformUS pace projector, American Revolution is shown on the lead. He's not exactly a speed horse, but when I look through the field, I kind of get why he's shown there. There's just no speed in here.
Yeah, there certainly isn't. I thought the same thing when I saw it. I was like, what is he doing on the front? Because I don't believe he's led since he broke his maiden, led a race early. He usually doesn't make the lead till at earliest, the stretch call. So yeah, that just kind of shows that there's not a whole lot of speed in this race. I don't know if he wants to lead, what the plan is. So I think the pace situation is pretty murky in here. When I look at it, all that tells me is I don't really want the horses that don't have much speed. I don't necessarily think that the top 2 that we show, American Revolution or Scalding, have to be up near the front, but I still think they are the 2 main players in here, and both are going to be really hard to beat. For me, it would be hard to come up with a third horse.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. When I kind of draw up how I think this race is going to be run, it just feels like it's either going to line up as Scalding American Revolution or vice versa on the front end. And they might just be the 2 best horses in the race anyway, and they're likely to get the 2 best trips relative to the pace. So it feels like they're going to finish that way in some order. American Revolution, based on his races from last year, he is the better horse. And I mean, he's the kind of runner that I wouldn't have been surprised if Todd Pletcher had taken a shot in the Met Mile, because he looked like that kind of horse last year. I get that would be a pretty tough spot to try off a long layoff, but he was developing into the kind of horse that might be in the horse of the year conversation this year if he takes a step forward off his 3-year-old form. Obviously, he's got to do some running to get to that point, but he's pretty talented. Scalding, I mean, he's a horse that's kind of surprised me at every turn because he didn't look like that much at the start of his career, but he has just taken a step forward with every start, and I don't want to be surprised when the same thing happens again. It's the way Shug McGahee operates. He brings these horses along slowly, so he's going to have to move forward, and American Revolution's going to have to move back a little bit for Scalding to win, but I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility at all.
Yeah, I agree. For me, that's kind of a toss-up on those. Just a couple others I wanted to mention in here. I really wanted to try to make a case for Dynamic One because I did like his race last time. I thought he ran really well in that Ben Ali at Keeneland, but I just can't get past the lack of pace, and I think he's going to run into some problems in there and probably get shuffled back and just, I'm sure he'll run fine. His speed figure was a good 121 last time, but I just couldn't get past the pace. And another one that'll probably take money is Proxy, but he just was handled pretty easily by both Scalding and Dynamic One last time, so it would be hard for me to see him turn in the tables.
And in case anybody's confused about it, you might notice that Luis Saez has gotten off American Revolution to ride Proxy here. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that is because Luis Saez had already committed to Proxy by the time that American Revolution was rerouted to this race. So in that situation, when a jockey gives a commitment like that, he can't just take off the other horse. It's a loyalty thing. I think there also might be a fine involved for that. So American Revolution will be ridden by Florent Giroux here, but I wouldn't just assume that it's because Luis Saez chose the other horse. It probably is quite the opposite.
Yeah, it's some good information, and I would make a bet that you were correct in that assessment because it would be pretty illogical for him to pick Proxy otherwise.
All right, well, things have not been that complicated so far, but that changes when we get to the last race in this sequence, the Audubon Stakes, going 1.1 miles on the turf course for 3-year-olds. 11 runners signed on here, Craig, and frankly, I've had trouble drawing a line through any of them saying that there are, that many horses that can't win this race. I mean, maybe some of the long shots like Hit a Den, Play Action Pass are a little tough to make, but I could make cases for 9 of the 11 runners in this spot.
Yes, I went through this race handicapping. I think at various times I had about five different top picks in here, and I think I am definitely going to spread somewhat in this race because I just couldn't really narrow it down. I do think there's some interesting horses at prices in here. The pace projector doesn't really lend any help. There's no flag. The field is kind of spread out, I guess. I can't really argue with Major General on the front end, but who really knows? Because he's never been on the turf before. I'll be interested to see what you think of him and his breeding and turf chances as we move forward. But yeah, this whole race is just kind of a big cloud for me. I couldn't really narrow it down. So I just went, I'll mention a few of the horses I think are obviously are contenders in here. The first one, I think you have to use James Jones, the Chad Brown trainee, who looked really good breaking his maiden at Churchill. He took a big step forward from his maiden start at Tampa, where he was beaten but ran pretty well, but he jumped up to a 103 speed figure. So I thought he had a good shot. A couple that interest me that come out of the same race, a big allowance race at Keeneland, a big purse allowance race where Speaking Scout was able to beat Tallahatchie Bridge. And I actually thought both of them ran very well that day. They have the best speed figures in the field, 107 for the winner. And Tallahatchie Bridge got the same, beating the length because he was closing into that slow pace. And I do like that both of them really finished off that race strong. But I would also be the first to say that both of them had really, really good trips in there. Speaking Scout was able to sit just off of that slow pace, kind of inherited the lead when the leader backed out of it. Finished strong, and Tallahatchie Bridge actually had an absolutely perfect ride from Florent Giroux that day. Was able to steer inside from the outside post, save ground all the way. But it's not like I want to detract too much from it because he was still finishing pretty strong. So that's three I will definitely be using. Who's some of the ones you like, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting that you start with the horses that are coming out of the allowance races and the maiden races, and I get it, they've got upside of this race. I think, though, that there are two legitimate players in here that are exiting graded stakes events, and those are the two morning line favorites, Grand Sonata and Smoke and Tea. I don't have a big problem with either of these horses. Grand Sonata, I thought got a pretty good trip in the Transylvania last time. Probably should have been third that day because another runner, Napoleonic War, who was fourth, had a bit of trouble and arguably could have been right there with Side Dog at the end. But in Grand Sonata, he's been coming along pretty nicely for Todd Pletcher, just gradually improving with each start. I'm not going to be surprised at all when he runs well here. He's got a good inside post position. I don't know exactly how the rails are going to be positioned on Saturday at Churchill Downs. I know that there's been some issues with the turf course there. I think it's evened out a little bit since that Derby weekend. But Grand Sonata makes sense to me. And Smoke and Tea, he's coming out of that tough American turf on Derby Day. He was inside for about the first 6 furlongs of that race, which was not where you wanted to be on the turf course. Did angle out for the stretch drive, but I thought finished up pretty decently. Was right there with Side Dog for third at the end of that race. So he makes plenty of sense, and another one's going out for the Shug McGahee barn, so it's not going to be a big surprise when he takes another step forward. I mean, in my mind, they're kind of the two horses to beat, and it's just a matter of how short a price you think is really fair on them compared to some of those other runners with upside. I know you wanted to get my take on the outside drawn horse Major General, who is making his first start on the turf. I'm not a big fan of him switching over. I mean, I'm not going to be shocked when he handles it. He is a son of Constitution, and the Constitutions tend to do pretty well on either surface, but it's not like it's some big turf pedigree on the dam side. It just feels like a bit of a move of desperation with a horse that hasn't really panned out as they hoped he would on the dirt. So he could be the pace setter here, but he wasn't one that I really wanted to focus on too much. Craig, you mentioned that allowance race at Keeneland that Speaking Scout and Tallahatchie Bridge are coming out of. I actually wanted a different horse out of that race, and that was the number 1 Spin Wheel, who finished far behind them in 6th, but going back, I thought he was the one that had the most difficult trip that day. He kind of got a little rank in the early going when Julien Leparoux was really intent on raiding him at the back of the pack, even though they weren't moving that quickly up front. He was just left with way too much to do when they came into the stretch. Looked like he was trying to lug in a little bit, but he was finishing up pretty well at the end of that race to get within about 3.5 lengths of those leaders after being so far back in the early going. And I know this horse has been off the board in both of his turf races, and just a glance at his PPs might lead you to believe that he's a better dirt horse, but I think he's been subtly compromised in both of those turf races, even going all the way back to his career debut at Saratoga. He ran deceptively well that day. There wasn't much pace signed on. He was closing pretty well at the end, closing in tandem with some horses that have since wound up in stakes races. And Spin Wheel has a turf pedigree. On the bottom side, he's a half-brother to Moon Over Miami, who's a multiple graded stakes place turf horse for Bill Mott. So I think Spin Wheel is ultimately going to pan out as a turf horse. It's just a matter of whether or not this is the right spot for him, but feels like he's going to be a price in this race, especially with this low profile jockey riding. He's one that I would definitely want to have in my tickets at double-digit odds.
Yeah, he's going to be on mine as well. I think that race was strong, and I don't have anything against the two morning line favorites. I think they're both fine. They both could win, but I also think this race is ripe for some others, which is why I went to the allowance races, just based on the speed figures that the others are running. And sometimes with these 3-year-olds, the horses who have been winning stakes were maybe a little more mature and the others have caught up. So I did really like that allowance race, just kind of it doesn't really affect today, but when I was watching that replay, a horse I definitely put in my stable mail was Icarus, who finished third. I kind of wish he was in this race because he would have been my top pick in here. But yeah, it's one I'm going to spread pretty wide. Another horse we didn't mention was Summer Anthem, who had a big figure maiden win, changing to the Mike Maker barn from Rudolph Brissett, but he did nothing wrong at Keeneland either. I was actually pretty impressed with him. He's another I'm going to use. He was able to chase a runoff leader, which is something which usually is not the best of trips. A horse actually established a clear lead, then just kind of ran off, opened up by nearly 10, and didn't seem to face Southern Anthem. He took over and ran really strong through the lane to hold off the others. A horse named Pancake House, who is pretty decent horse in his own right. So I don't want to totally dismiss him either, Summer Anthem.
Yeah, I was kind of a mixed opinion about Summer Anthem. I liked the visual of his last race for all the reasons that you mentioned, and also it looked like that horse, that runner-up Pancake House, was going to blow by him at the 8th pole, and I thought that Summer Anthem really dug in to fend that horse off. My problem is something that you often talk about, Craig, on these turf races. When a horse runs off like that, they can kind of drag the entire field into running or setting a faster pace than they normally would. And sometimes, if the other races on the card featured much slower paces, it can lead to a faster final time than you would otherwise see this class of horse run. And it just feels like that 105 TimeformUS speed figure, and that's not out of line with the buyer. They're both high. It just feels like it's a little inflated for the horses in this race. Pancake House came back and lost at a short price, didn't run particularly well in his next start. I wonder how strong that Keeneland maiden race really was. And interesting that they put this horse up for sale right after that. He sold for actually $150,000 at the Keeneland April sale, I should say. So I wasn't really sure what to do with him. I think if he's a big price, I could see using him, but I thought he'd probably have to take a step forward, kind of counter to what that speed figure might indicate. But yeah, this is a race where I'd want to spread a little bit. I'll be interested to see how that Chad Brown runner James Jones gets bet. He's obviously has a lot of upside, but just seems like all around the country and race after race, Chad Brown is just getting overbet. It's no secret that he's winning everything on the turf right now, really everything on any surface right now, especially in New York. So I'm not going to be surprised when James Jones goes off as close to favorite in this race, if not the outright favorite. And I'm not sure I'd want to take him at that short a price, and I think you could find some value on some others in here. This might even be a race that you want to play from an individual standpoint outside of the pick 5 sequence.
Yeah, is it overbet if he keeps winning everything, though? That's one of those things I really struggle with. His ROI is certainly very good of late, so that's a tough call for people to make when a trainer's going as well as Chad Brown really is, because they're going to get overbet, but when they keep winning, you also don't want to get knocked out by those horses as well. So really interesting sequence. I don't think I had any more in here I wanted to talk about. There's probably a couple contenders that we skipped over even. That's how deep this field is.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion with Chad Brown, because you're right, the ROI is pretty healthy. If you look at his ROI going back to the beginning of 2022, it's hovering right around $2 for all starters everywhere in North America, which is it's really insane to get to June and have a $2 ROI as the recognized best trainer in the country. That's kind of crazy. It feels like it has to, revert to the mean at some point, but I don't know. It hasn't happened yet. You would have thought it would happen already. It just seems like over the past month, the stats have gotten even stronger than they were. So I don't have a big argument for that point you made about Chad Brown's barn. Craig, let's just briefly go back to the start, recap the sequence. I think that we both have a similar idea about trying to go a little bit more thinly in the early races and spread later on.
Yeah, in the early races, I am pretty split on Army Wife and Pauline's Pearl. I'm glad we'll get to see the tote board, and how heavily Pauline's Pearl it will be bet will kind of influence how heavily I play those two, I would think. In the next leg, I think we both landed on Fluoroform. I like the upside that one's shown, but I'm not totally against Get Smoking in here. He could easily go wire to wire. And as more of a C type, I might throw in horses like Admission Office and like the King, who, as the longest shot in the field, I don't think is over his head at all, and it's, in a logical spot for him. In the Aristides, there's just no speed, so I'm going to focus on the outside horses, Top Gunner, Jalen Journey, and Long Range Toddy, and kind of play against closers like Bob's Edge and Miles Ahead, horses that I just think are going to be up against it. So I really favor those three. In the Blame Stakes, for me, it's just a 2-horse race, Scalding and American Revolution. If anybody else wins, I won't. I tried to make a case for Dynamic One, but with the lack of pace, I just couldn't do it. And I think the others are a bit over their head. And then just going short in most of those races is going to leave me lots of bullets for the last race. I will use Spin Wheel. I'll use the 2 morning line favorites, Grand Sonata that you talked about, and Smokin' Tea. But I'm also going to use some others. Speaking Scout, Tallahatchie Bridge. I would probably make Tallahatchie Bridge my top play if we have to give one out. I'll also use James Jones and Summer Anthem.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into too much detail because we are very similar through the first 4 legs of this sequence. I would just note the spots where we're a little bit different. I want to see the prices. I might lean on Army Wife a little bit in that first leg. I would use Like the King as a backup in the 8th race, but we agree on Fluoroform. He's the key horse in that race for both of us. In that Aristides, I would want to use Jalen Journey very prominently along with Top Gunner. The only other horse that I would use as a backup is Bango. The others that have to come from farther back, I'd probably let beat me. Craig and I are the same in the 10th race, that Blame. And then to close things out, I want to use both of those back class horses, the Grand Sonata and Smokin' Tea. But the number 1, Spin Wheel, I'm making my top pick in this race just from a value standpoint. He's one that I really do want to use prominently in this last leg. I'm not against James Jones. I just feel like he's probably going to be an underlay. And the 2 others from that allowance race that Craig mentioned, Tallahatchie Bridge and Speaking Scout, they can obviously win this race. But I prefer the other one out of there at a bigger price. So the 1, 2, and 7 would be the ones that I would lean on most heavily in that Audubon to close things out. Well, Craig, that's it for the Churchill sequence. I think we were able to get that as concisely as we could. Not a ton going on in some of those early races, but it feels like one of those sequences that you might be able to play without creating too big of a budget, because there are some singles that you can latch onto.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, that's a pretty manageable ticket. And I think if you can get a couple prices home, it's still going to pay well. So, yeah, good solid card. There's even another graded stakes race earlier on the card before the pick 5 sequence at grade 3. I think it's a Regret on the turf. So solid card at Churchill. One thing I forgot to check, believe it or not, is it a night card or is it a day card? I think it's a regular day card now that I think about it.
It is a daytime card. I think the pick 5 sequence kicks off at 3:50 Eastern time.
Good to know. I kind of like those nighttime cards, but that's okay. My wife will prefer that it's a daytime card. I can tell you that.
Well, everybody, that's it for the forecast this week. Craig and I will be back next week to do our usual set of podcasts. We'll recap some of the stakes action on the Pacecast. And then a little bit later next week, we will do our Belmont Stakes edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. Probably going through the Belmont Stakes in depth, but also some of those undercard stakes at Belmont Park on Saturday. Hard to call them undercard stakes, though, Craig, because they're all Grade 1 events. So looking forward to discussing that in depth next week. We'll probably aim to record that on Thursday of next week to get it out a little bit early. But everybody, thanks for listening this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening, and make sure to catch those TimeformUS podcasts coming out for Belmont Stakes Week next week.